So, greetings, everyone. My name is Peter Young, and I'm your host today. I'm the president of Societe de Chimie Industrielle, and also I'm the CEO of Younger Partners, the investment bank. And it's my great privilege not only to welcome you to this session, which I think you're going to find very interesting, but also to manage the Q&A at the end. For those of you who have not used this particular technology platform, I think you're in for a treat for a couple reasons. One is, although the speech part will seem very similar to the more common platforms that people use, what's unique is that at the end, we'll switch everyone into an electronic ballroom, and it's up to you if you want to stay or not stay, but there'll be tables and you'll be able to join tables, talk to each other, network. But one of the tables will actually be headed by Bertrand Loy, who will be at that table. So if you want to ask him additional questions or talk to him, just join his table. And all you have to do is click on a seat, and suddenly you'll be at that table and you'll be able to see and talk to everyone who's on that table. And if you hover your mouse over each person before you choose a seat, you'll be able to see who's at the table. So I just want to start out just briefly with a general introduction. First of all, I think most of you know Societe de Chimie Industrielle, but if you don't, it's actually a 102-year-old organization that was founded for the purpose of really a number of missions. One is to provide education and insights to people who are involved in the chemical and the pharmaceutical industries and those who serve the industry. Second, as a way of people to get to know each other and form relationships. But we also have a major program around students who are studying chemistry, chemical engineering, or biotech, where we provide scholarships, mentor programs, and recently we conducted a career fair and forum, which was highly successful. And in addition to that, we award the well-known International Palladium Medal Award to an individual who has contributed very heavily towards the mission of the Societe, and that's been going on since 1961. So it's really been quite a while. And last, I would just say that this is part of a series that we have throughout the year where we try to get interesting topics, interesting speakers talking about things that we think that all of you either worry about or get very excited about. And hopefully today's session will be in the category of excited about. The last thing I want to say is we have two upcoming events that I want to alert you to. On May 27th, we have a virtual happy hour. No speeches, just people get to chat. And it's extraordinary what people are able to talk about. It's really exciting. But also, we have people logging in from Shanghai, from Munich, and so forth. So quite an international group. And then on June 2nd, we have a very interesting topic. We'll have a panel talking about electronic vehicles, which is a really important and a hot topic. And it will not just be about the vehicles, but also the whole system of supplying materials and batteries and chemicals and so forth. So obviously relevant to the chemical industry. So with that, let me just say, I think that the title of this session is Success Through Unconventional Wisdom, a fireside chat with Bertrand Loy, who is the CEO of Entegris. It's very interesting because all of you really struggle trying to determine what kind of strategy you should follow given the constant change of the world, the structure of the world and economies. And you're trying to trade off, how do I make sure that I end up with a strong business position, attractive return, superior shareholder and stakeholder values? And it's very challenging. I think it's probably more challenging today than it was 20, 30 years ago when life and the world was much simpler. It's very easy for people to say, well, I'll follow conventional wisdom. I'll try to be a pure play. I try to be a leader. I'll just do bolt-on acquisitions, etc. But it turns out that conventional wisdom doesn't always get you to the right place. And I think the reason for this session is Entegris is essentially an example of a company that follows some conventional wisdoms, but also does some things that in fact are not conventional that have been quite successful. And I think out of the session, I hope all of you come away with some insights and not necessarily saying, oh, I should do exactly what Bertrand does, but actually more where you can step back and look at a broader picture and say, in my situation, are there some strategies that in fact may not be conventional, but would be very, very successful? And so we're going to explore Bertrand's career, how Entegris has followed at times conventional and unconventional wisdom. So that's the purpose of this session. So we're going to do this as a fireside chat. And so let me start out. Bertrand, you've had a really interesting career. Maybe if you could walk us through your career history and some of the key roles and transitions that you went through during that period, throughout your career.
I'm happy to do that, Peter. And before I start, let me thank you for the opportunity. I don't know if I will live up to your expectations of being truly unconventional. I will leave that to you. But happy to take your first question about a little bit of my career. I'll start maybe a little bit earlier than that. I am French, as you can tell from my accent. Probably I grew up in a pretty remote part of France called Brittany. Very nice during the summer month, very secluded during the winter. And I was happily living my life there until I was probably 12 years old, when my aunt wanted to visit her daughter, my cousin, in London. She was studying in London. And she said, look, I don't want to go alone. Why don't you come with me? We'll be in Paris for a few days, and then we'll spend a couple of weeks in the UK. And that was the first time I got on a train, on a boat, flew back on an airplane. And I realized that there was a big world out there, and that world was really, really fun. And so when I came back, decided to study hard so that I would actually find a job, any job, I had no idea what it would be, that would actually open up the doors to the world. So at the end of high school, I applied to both the engineering route and the business route. And for some reason, I convinced myself that the business route was probably the surest way to see the world. So that's what I did. And as part of my business studies, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I wanted to do with that degree. I spent time in banking, and I realized, no offense, Peter, but I hated it. I hated money as the raw material, and money being the finished product. And it made me realize how much I was missing science. I liked it, and I was missing it. So at the end of my senior year, there was a career fair, and a company called Sandoz at the time. It was at the time still a big chemical conglomerate. It was before the merger with Ciba-Geigy many years later. And they had a wonderful program that would actually consist of giving you a job in Switzerland, observe you for a year or two, and then sending you for 2 or 3 year assignments a couple of times before giving you a permanent job. So that's what I did. I went to Switzerland. Into that, it was operational audit, so a little bit like GE. So you would do a bunch of different projects. You would spend 1 month I spent 1 month in Austria, auditing the development process of a tech center. I would spend, another month in Italy looking at manufacturing processes, and you learn a lot. And Sandoz being a Swiss-German company, everything, I knew nothing coming out of college, obviously, but everything was so structured. You had books for everything. You could just go back to what the best practices would be for all of those various processes. After a year, my boss called me in his office and said, Bertrand, we have your next assignment and it's going to be Japan. And so, well, boss, it's very nice, but I've always told you I would rather stay somewhere in the US, Latin America, Europe. And they looked at me and said, well, it's going to be Japan or Nigeria. That's about the two only options. So he was like very persuasive, but he was kind enough to say, but if you want, maybe you can get on a plane and go to Japan to check it out. I said, well, based on the way you're formulating my options, I don't think I need to do that extra trip. I think I'm just going to back and go. But I love Japan. I knew nothing about Asia. I'd never been in Asia, and I spent 3 years in Japan, and that was tremendous. Those were in the early 90s. That's when books like The Japan That Can Say No were written. This is when the price or the value of the land where the imperial palace sits was worth the equivalent of the value of California. So a big bubble, obviously, bubble that bursted a few years later, but it was great. And Sandoz Pharma, which is the organization I was part of, was actually a very successful business at the time in Japan. It was the second largest non-Japanese pharma company in Japan. And I was part of that strategic planning function. And we worked on being actually the first non-Japanese company to build its own distribution channel. We, devised plans to actually start doing more R&D in Japan and so on and so forth. And I had tremendous opportunity to work with great consulting practices to do that. So it was a fun time learning a new culture, new methods, and thinking strategically and learning how to think strategically. But after 3 years, my time was up. So my boss this time asked me what I wanted to do. And I was recently married to, actually I married a chemical engineer, which was probably another way to reconnect with science. And she was from Mexico, and I didn't speak a word of Spanish. I said, a Spanish-speaking country would be wonderful, number one. And number two, I've come to realize that strategies are wonderful, but they are priceless unless you can really implement them and execute them. And I would love to have something that is a little bit more hands-on. So they sent me to Panama, and I was essentially in charge of distribution, finance, IT, HR, everything but medical reps and medical affairs. And I stayed there a little less than 3 years. I was 27 years old, and if I was a cat, I probably used about 5 lives there. It was very different from Japan. You learned to lead in a very different way. Forget about the Nemawashi concept. Leaders are expected to be more directive. And I was exposed to things I was absolutely not ready for. And in that short time frame, I got shot. I had a contract from the local mafia on my head. I had a machete on my throat for 2 minutes, which is a very long time, especially when you're in a slum in El Salvador. And then I was asked to play God in Guatemala, which was something I was absolutely not qualified to do either. All of that in professional context. So anyway, a lot of learning there, making you really understand who you are at your core. It was a little bit like the, Hercules 12 labors, if you want. But we made huge progress. We rescued that region. The business grew 20%. We made it profitable. The looming risk of having to shut down the region because it was illiquid was solved. By the end of 2 years, most of the intercompany debts were repaid. And I was starting to look good or feeling good. I mean, I was spending more time scuba diving and enjoying life. And one day I came home and my wife was greeting me at the door with a big smile saying, hey, I told you about me wanting to do an MBA. I got accepted at INSEAD. You told me you would follow me. Now it's your turn to follow me. So that's what I did. And Sandoz was not, didn't have a job in France. They offered me a great job in the Netherlands to be the CFO of their operations, which was a quite large operation. But we just had a baby girl, and it was in the middle of nowhere, that site. So my wife would have never found a job nearby after her MBA. So I decided to leave. And it was hard because I loved Sandoz, I loved what I was doing, and things were going well for me. But I stumbled into a company called Millipore. They had a job in France. They were actually spinning off part of, or splitting one division into two, and they were really building a team. And they were looking for an international controller, and I said, okay, I can do that for 2-3 years. It was a big adjustment. You come from a Swiss-German company, well-oiled, really well managed, very tight, strong discipline, and then you get into this $700 million revenue, high-tech US company, and I thought I made the biggest mistake of my career. Everything was messy. The systems were not stable. The processes were undocumented. And I thought, my God, what have I done? But after 6 months, I realized that I was kind of liking it. And it really grew on me. I loved that passion, that energy, different philosophy around risk-taking, and an incredible focus on the customer. It was fun. It was exhilarating. So I must say that at that time, I realized that I never would want to work again for a very large company, because small high-tech company were really too much fun. So anyway, so I stayed in that division for about 4 or 5 years. At the time, I was on the path for a CFO succession at Millipore, and they told me that they really wanted to get to know me a little bit more. So they wanted me to come to the US, and that was great. I had always wanted to come to the US. But what was interesting is they said, we are thinking about you to be the next CIO, so the next IT guy for the company. And I said, well, are you sure? And, I'm not an IT professional. And said, well, yes, we know that, thank you. But the departing CIO, who actually was leaving to run Oracle Consulting for North America, said that, I was its most demanding user, and I had a clear vision of what IT could be delivering for the user community, and said, well, let me give it a try. So we packed, we moved to Boston, and it was 2 great years. I knew nothing about IT, but as it turned out, we became the first Oracle customer to migrate to a one single global instance. So we were essentially running all of our global operations on one big server, relying on the network. This is an architecture, obviously, that every company in the world is using today, but at the time we were the first ones. We had business object on the top, so we had real-time analytics, allowing us to make better decisions than any one of our competitors. So, it was great. I got to meet Larry Ellison and Ray Lane, and got their recognition as the craziest of their customer that was willing to take all of that risk to move to a single instance. And so that was, I was enjoying that. And a few years later, the Millipore CFO came to me and told me that Millipore had decided to spin off their semiconductor business. They would actually go through an IPO, and she said, look, I'm not going anywhere as a CFO of Millipore, so if you're still interested in one day becoming a CFO, now is your chance. So I decided to move on and take on that challenge, and learn a lot. I mean, get ready for an IPO in 6 months. When you have never been a CFO before, was a tall challenge, but we did it. We did it successfully. We IPO'd in August 2001, but of course, 9/11 came right after that, followed by a massive downturn of the semiconductor industry. Our top line shrunk by 60%. Our stock price went from $15 to $3.50. So you learn how to deal with investors, and it's really baptism by fire. And you really have to earn back your credibility, and you understand how difficult and painful that can be. As part of that, we also learned that Microlis was the name of that spin-off, was just too small with $300 million in annual revenue, and we needed a bigger boat. So we accepted an offer to merge with Entegris in 2005. Interestingly enough, I was a casualty of that merger. The social issues around mergers, so the CFO role was given to the other guy. But I believed in the combination. I offered to stay to help with the integration, and within 6 months, the CEO of Entegris said that he was hoping that I would stay, and gave me manufacturing, IT, logistics, all of the parts where the integration battleground will take place, and kept me busy for 4 years before I became the COO. And then in 2012 became the COO of Entegris. So I know I'm taking probably way too much time. It's making me realize that I'm getting old, Peter.
No.
Just too many stories to tell. So I'll stop here. I can come back to some of this.
No, actually, I wanted you to go through that, because actually it's very much tied to this overall topic. Because I do think my theory, in looking at what you've done and how you've managed Entegris, my hypothesis is that because you had such a variety of different experiences with different types of companies, different functions, so forth, that had a great deal of influence on your approach to running Entegris, and your ability and the willingness to consider more diverse paths, right? Because I think in your career that happened many times, right, where you were forced to do that. Maybe tell me that. Any comments on? Do you feel that was true? That this varied experience in geography and types of job functions, do you think that somehow contributed to the way in which you've run Entegris and formed its strategies?
Absolutely. I frankly don't think I would be where I am today if it wasn't for many of those experiences that I went through. But I think, at some level, I think the life choices that I've made are probably also telling you that I'm curious by nature. I like trying new things. In retrospect, as I mentioned, I should have studied engineering, and if I had, I think I would be working in R&D today, happily developing new products. But I chose a different path, and I'm still trying to reconcile the two. And my way of reconciling it, I think, is experimenting. And I think I'm experimenting with business strategies and concepts. And to your point, I think that all of those experiences in my formative years have been very important. You said earlier that you have a lot of students on the call, and I don't know if that's the case today or not, but I would really encourage them to take on jobs where they are offered job rotations, where they offered international assignments. I think that you learn a lot that way. It gets you out of your comfort zone, learning new languages, new cultures, obviously. It teaches you humility as well. It's a lot harder to be smart in a language you don't speak. It also forces you to be more authentic. You can't hide behind your words and language. When in your native language, you can do a lot to really, hide who you are or what you think really. When you're dealing with a language that you don't master as well, you're just going to have to work hard enough to just say things clearly and succinctly in a way that people can understand. So there's something more genuine, I think, about you, and ultimately, I think you grow as a person. But
You know,
go ahead, Peter.
yeah, walking through some of the things that are unconventional, I think one of the things that a lot of people say is conventional wisdom is that if you're not a really large company, that you can't afford to be diverse, right? That you have to be a pure play and so forth. And even large companies, there's some people that say, well, being diverse in different businesses is not a good thing. Better to be focused regardless of your size. What's very interesting about Entegris is you really are diverse. You're in at least three segments, depending upon how you like to count. That have different technologies, different different manufacturing and so forth. Tell me, how has that worked out? And how have you made that work? Because that's one thing that a lot of people. That's the first thing they say. Pure play, focus. That's the way to success. That's how you get analysts to love you, et cetera, right? Unless you're very large, right? And even then, you got to be careful.
Well, I think that there's some truth, obviously, in the conventional wisdom. I mean, you have to start with your core. You have to focus on it. You have to make it as vibrant and strong as you can, because without that, there's nothing else you will be able to take on. There's no other challenge that you will be able to take on. But the problem usually with the core is the way companies define the core, and usually they define it very narrowly as a combination of products and markets and capabilities, and before you know it, it's too tight. And because it's too tight, I mean, if you look at histories of companies, you have very few companies that have been able to remain relevant and successful for very, very long periods of times, right? I mean, and I think it's something that we need to all remember. So as a CEO, I think the question is, are you managing the business with a 5-year horizon, a 10-year horizon, a 15-year horizon? And and this is where I stand. I think my responsibility is just to, one day transition out of this role and leave it in a better stage than I found it. And for me, a better stage means having built more optionality for the platform. And so that's how we think about it. And for us, it's really about creating value. And if you think about the three platforms that we have, it's in originally Entegris was about high purity packaging. And the question was, well, could we do more? Wouldn't it be even greater value for our customers if not only we protect certain levels of purity, but we could enable the purity?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And that led to the merger with Entegris. And it was all about enabling and then protecting the purity of the chemistries and the substrates used in the semiconductor industry. And then in 2010, 11, when the industry started to transition to 28 nanometer architectures requiring much higher levels of purity, we realized that it was actually harder to develop the right level of filtration. It was taking longer. And the reason it was taking longer was that we didn't have enough knowledge of the chemistry itself. So we reached the conclusion that getting into materials and chemistry was actually a pathway to enable further differentiation for our filtration and our packaging. It was a leap of faith, though, because we knew that the big risk, obviously, would be that other chemical companies would then view us as a competitor and would be no longer willing to buy our filters and high purity drums. So we had to spend a lot of time convincing ourselves first and then our customers that it would be okay. We would be able to actually compete in some instances and partner in other instances. And actually, my experience in life science or pharma in particular was a great help because I could point to that industry and show them that companies in can find actually ways to compete, partner, and in very effective ways. If you think about pharma, very often they would license out certain drugs because they don't have the right capabilities in a certain therapeutic area, and in another therapeutic area they would actually compete, and they can do that in a very structured and disciplined and very effective way. So we had a lot of far-reaching discussions within the semiconductor industry where, in the past it was very binary. You are either with me or you're against me. And we said, no, there's an alternative to that. We can actually, and we can do that in a way that is, will create value for both parties. And so that was the hypothesis, and it worked. I think it made us a much better and stronger supplier of filters and high purity packages. And I think it actually is now allowing us to get closer to the wafer where greater value is. And we've been very successful as a materials and a chemical supplier as well.
So, in a sense, diversity clearly has benefited you greatly. And in fact, it sounds like, though, some of the diversification wasn't because you said, "Oh, I want to be in that," but it was based on what the changes that were happening in the industry, right? That, well, if it's changing this way, we need to be in this space. So, some of it was driven by the industry changes that you were facing, right?
It's driven by the technology roadmap. It's driven by the customer interaction. It's really, again, a lot of our decisions, whether that's on the M&A side or the organic development efforts. It's really about how can we increase the value for our customers. And I think that as long as you believe that the choices you're making will ultimately translate into customer value creation, I think you're on the right path. I mean, for me, this is the ultimate compass.
It's interesting. We do both corporate strategy and investment banking, which is somewhat unique because investment banks don't do strategy and strategy firms don't do investment banking. But there are times where those two things are required to get to the answer. We had one client, and this is an interesting because it relates to you, where they said, well, even though the customer is the same for a product line that we're not in, since we don't know how to manufacture it, or we currently don't know how to manufacture it, we're uncomfortable going to that, even though that product sold heavily to our current customers. And it sounds like in your case, you didn't care about that. You felt that if there was a requirement if there was a value to be in that product, even if you didn't know how to make it at the present moment, that it was important to either figure out how to make it or buy something so that you would have that operation. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, I think that too often people are giving in easy trade-offs, right? It's either or. And it's either high quality or low cost. It's either speedy development of new product or it's a rigorous development process. And I've come to actually not accept those discussions. Of course, it's hard to be both, but because it's hard, it's the reason why there is value. If it was easy, everybody would do it, and there would be no value. So I think the people around me have come to realize that usually those are not the type of discussions they want to have with me because I will never really capitulate. And I think that again, I think this is. But by combining things that are really not meant to be, if you can do that, and you can be the only one or the one that does it earlier than your competitors, that's how you're going to build ultimately differentiation. And you're going to have something that is very unique that would be very difficult for anyone to emulate. I mean, if you think about our portfolio today, we are the only company in the world that has this end-to-end capability where we can really develop a new blend of chemistry for highly selective etch. And at the same time as we do that, we can develop the best known method of filtration, and we can work with our customers and say, well, by the way, how do you want to transport that? Give us the form factor, give us exactly how you're going to be hooking that up to your fab. We're going to develop that intelligent, high purity packaging solution for you. And oh, by the way, so what you're getting from us is not just the chemistry, but you're getting fastest time to solution, which for you means fastest time to market. And in semiconductor, that means pricing power, and which is, well, I guess it's probably true for any market, but that's everything in the semiconductor space. So again, it's really trying to combine things that may not be intuitively connected in a way that will result into very unique customer value.
Yeah.
So it would be really hard to disaggregate for anybody or to aggregate for your competitors.
It's very interesting because part of this is to be able to see things that others don't see, or see them in a non-traditional way. And one of the things we like to do when we recruit is there's a problem where there are some dots, and the test is you have to take your pen or pencil and you have to connect all of the dots with lines without ever lifting your pen. And the interesting thing is 75% of people fail that test because they self-limit themselves. They don't realize that no one said that you couldn't go beyond the outlines of the dots, right? And in fact, the only way to connect all of them is to go outside of the dots, but people limit themselves. So we love doing that because when we apply that, it tells you whether someone can think expansively, right? And think about the problem without limiting themselves, right? But it sounds like what you're doing is really focusing on, well, I'm not going to focus so much on the product itself and how it's made. I'm going to focus on what the customer's overall need within a parameter. And then I'm going to try to solve that, right? And help them make more money. I think that's probably one way of interpreting what you're saying.
I think that's a good summary, Peter. And then the other thing is maybe the reason why it's easier for me to do that than other people is that I'm not technical. So, as a leader, I always ask myself, how can I add value to the organization? And, I'm not a material scientist. I'm not going to be the one defining the new synthesis path for that particular molecule. But what I can do is force the team to think about value above and beyond just technology. And in fact, a lot of the technology companies, especially when you're small, you are so focused on the technology itself that you ignore most everything else. And if you think about Entegris, we always had the reputation of being a great technology platform, but we were a lousy manufacturer. And you cannot do that in an industry like the semiconductor industry. So we constantly forced the business leaders and Entegris to think about the various elements of their value proposition above and beyond just the technology. And I think over time, I think it has proven to be extremely valuable. I mean, if you go back in time, 15 years ago, just to quantify my statement, our defective part per millions were about 50,000, which is a sigma level of about probably 3, a little over 3. Today we run the business, a much bigger business, with less than 100 defective part per million. That's above 5, 5.1, maybe sigma. And that's, so we were one of the worst manufacturers 15 years ago. Today, I would argue we're probably one of the very best. So it's really about adding that that value in a more complete way. And quality is just one example, but really, it's really thinking about the customer in a very complete way, and feeling about or thinking about the customer engagement model in a very complete way.
Well, there's some advantage of not being a technologist, because then you can always say, this may be a stupid question, but why is this true, right? And there's an advantage of that, because then you don't get into the dueling PhDs, right? And so forth. By the way, I'll have a short story about how technology people could get totally lost. There's a good friend of mine who is a CEO today, but he started his career at DuPont, and he became a product manager, and he was assigned to the team that had developed Teflon, right? So he had the first meeting with them, and these scientists who were so excited, they said, look, this thing, Teflon, it doesn't stick to anything, it's just unbelievable. And he said, look, I'm not an engineer, but let me ask you this. Doesn't it have to stick on something, right? If you want to make pots and pans that don't stick, doesn't it have to stick on to the pot? He said there was about a 5 minutes of silence, right? And then then the scientist said, well, I guess we have some work to do. So it's an example of the scientists needing people who weren't scientists to try to get their priorities around all of the issues. Now, I want to turn to another issue. One of the interesting things about your business is that you are serving arguably one of the more volatile industries, right? The semiconductor industry is famous for volatility in terms of ups and downs and changes. Yet you have been able to achieve significantly higher growth than the market, right? And tell me how that, and going against some significant competitors, right? Some of which are fairly large. So tell me, and without revealing any state secrets, tell me what in the whole management of the company, because you consistently be able to do that. So this wasn't an accident of one year or another year. What has been the general philosophy that allowed you to grow faster than market? Because that's not easy to do, right?
Well, thank you for noticing it. And you're right. I mean, if you look at the period from 2000 to 2010, I mean, we were essentially growing at the pace of the industry, and I would argue maybe a little bit behind. And from 2010 to today, we've been, for the most part, every year outpacing the industry by about 2, 3 or more points. So how do you do that? Well, it's about the choices that you make. I mean, I think it's about really identifying emerging trends, identifying pockets of applications and markets that you will expect will grow faster than the rest of the industry, and then getting exposure to that. And you need to recognize that not everything is going to go right, because in business, it's never the case. So you need to build a portfolio and create a little bit of room for error. And I would say that the quality of our portfolio, the quality of our opportunity pipeline has kept improving. I mean, the rate of outperformance that we committed to 10 years ago was 1 to 2 points. We've increased that to 2 to 3, and most investors today on calls would tell me, Bertrand, you've been doing more than that recently, so why don't you just sign up for more? And I think, again, it's about that mindset. It's about building, an organization that can learn, adapt, evolve, and will be constantly looking for the new thing, as opposed to just retract to, okay, this is my core, And now the only thing I have to do is take care of that core. And I think that mindset that I was describing is really what our customers like. A lot of the growth today is in fact driven by products that we didn't have in the portfolio 10 years ago. A couple of examples for that would be, specialty coding. We were not a coding company 10 years ago. One of our large customers came and said, well, did you have that little technology in your portfolio that we believe you could actually expand to have these types of ALD coatings, and would you be willing to engage into a joint development with us? And we said yes. So and I think that was probably one of the big changes in the last 10 years. Is in the past we would say no very often, more often than we would say yes. And right now I think we have created enough room in our platform and portfolio to be saying yes more often than we would say no, and try new things, which also means that you need to recognize and be lucid about when things are not going right, and kill them. So today, if you look at our new product development efforts, I mean, first of all, I think we have a great system. We use a software called Sopheon. I was asking one of the VPs of Sopheon the other day, I said, well, if you think about the maturity level of our product development process and methods at Entegris, how would you rate us? And he said, you're probably at the level of Pfizer. So for a company our size to have that type of a discipline is, I think, something to be very, very proud of. And I think that is what is allowing us to take on risk, because we measure our kill rate, we measure obviously the value of our portfolio, and we really run this platform really as a gigantic portfolio. And we really are consciously making decisions about how much we want to invest in the core, how much we want to invest at the periphery of the core, and we track that very, very, carefully.
A lot of your growth has been your own internal R&D, and organic growth, et cetera. But some of it has been M&A. You did try to do a large deal with the Versum deal, which didn't go through. But for the most part, the deals that you've done have been, relatively small and so forth. What's been your philosophy about when do you focus on internal R&D to get to where you want to go versus doing acquisitions?
So, like many companies, we tend to have a bias for doing things ourselves. And I think for a lot of the core platforms that we have, that works actually pretty well, because we have, usually market leadership. We have very unique access to the right customers in those types of applications. So we are ideally positioned to do it ourselves, indeed. But when you start exploring outside, we usually do not have those capabilities. And I believe in the philosophy that Jim Collins described in his book, Good to Great, about firing a few bullets before firing a cannonball. And a lot of what we do are small deals because we want to learn. So it's all about the learning, making hypotheses and validating them. And the best way to do that is really to be in the business and really trying to get understanding of certain applications, certain markets, certain technologies, and see if there is actually value there and if we should actually scale that up. And then once you get validation of it, then you go for the cannonball. And Versum was one cannonball. That deal got taken away from us, but that's the philosophy around M&A. It's really about learning.
Yeah, that's right. Another question I have is, we've talked about strategy, we've talked about technology, we've talked about M&A and so forth, but I think most of us also recognize that a huge part of how successful a company is the leadership style and the corporate culture, right? Because even great technology. I remember when I was in private equity and venture capital, the senior partner, who was a legend in the venture business, he said, if you have a company with an A product technology, but a B culture or a B leadership, you'll end up with a B product. But if you have a B product or technology and you have an A leadership and corporate culture, they'll find a way to make the product into an A product. So it's really the leadership and the corporate culture is just as important as the technology. So how would you summarize sort of what the leadership and the corporate culture style has been at Entegris, and to what extent you feel that has either been conventional or unconventional, but at any rate, important to your success?
Well, I think it's fundamental. At the end of the day, technology is developed by people. So it's all about the people you get on the bus, to use, a Jim Collins analogy as well. By the way, we spent 2 days with Jim Collins many, many years ago when I was a COO, and it was actually a very, very special time. And that is really where we identified this flywheel model as something that we could use to really create that shared purpose, and to galvanize the organization. It's a very simple concept if you don't know it, but it's really about breaking down, the customer journey, and really characterizing the 3-4 key steps that you want your customer to experience as they engage with you, and how you're going to create value for your customer. And once you have that flywheel, then it makes it a lot easier to then engage your organization with, okay, what are the capabilities that you need to support, to create the conditions so that the next crank of the wheel is done easier and faster and better than your competitors. And that's, I think, this single focus around the customer and how we do it, that mindset, that I think makes our strength and allows us to compete very effectively with much larger companies. I think we are fast, we are purposeful in what we do, and we're not perfect, but actually we talk about where we spend our time is on where we could actually be better and where we need to be better. Some of my team members would say we don't take enough time to celebrate. And it's true, because we always are jumping onto the next area where we didn't behave in a way that would be consistent with our expectations. But I think that's that level of intensity and paranoia that makes us successful at the end.
Now, what I'm going to do is, I know we have one or two other questions that you and I thought about, but what I'd like to do, since we have another 5 minutes, is before we all go into the networking electronic lounge, if anyone has any questions, we're going to use a feature of this platform that's different, which is raise your hand. I'll call on you, and hopefully no one has a crazy question, and we'll let you actually tell us what your question is. So if anyone has a question, there's a raise hand feature, and please, well, no hands are raised. Anyone want to raise their hand and ask a question? Okay, here we go. All right. Charlie Miller, I have now provided you with the mic. You're actually on the stage, Charlie, so I hope you're dressed appropriately.
I am not, so
All right, go ahead and ask your question.
Quick question, Dr. Loy. Is Entegris the company that was manufacturing these plastic boxes to store and transport silicon wafers?
Yes, indeed. I mean, that was one of the first products of Entegris. So we call them wafer carriers or wafer shippers, and it's still actually a very important product platform for us. And if you go to any of the advanced fabs, if you look at all of the segments that you see on TV today about the Intel fabs or any other fab, you will see those boxes. We have about 90% market share for for those products right now in the world.
Right.
Great. All right. Any other questions that anyone would like to pose to Bertrand? All right. Well, with that, what I'd like to do, since we're at a few minutes away from the end of the hour, what I'd like to do is turn everyone into the electronic lounge or ballroom and choose a seat. And those of you who decide to stay, you don't have to stay, but if you do, choose a table, and one of the tables will be labeled by Bertrand Loy's name. So if you sit at that table, you'll be able to talk to him. And then we'll sort of, when it gets to a logical point where it seems like people are ready to go, we'll end the networking. So in a few minutes, all of you will be transported to the electronic ballroom.